So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Lizzie Moore, and I am with the group 350 Placer. And as you know, if you're attending this, we have this presentation today called What COVID is Teaching Us. The planet's health is our health, and it's featuring two doctors who I will introduce shortly. I wanted to just really quickly go over what 350 Placer is, as well as what the number 350 means. So 350 Placer is a local chapter of the international grassroots organization 350.org. And 350 is an important number because it's the parts per million of carbon that's thought to be safe and sustainable for life on our planet. And we've recently measured as high as 416. So 350 Placer is a group. We're committed to clean, sustainable living in Placer County, specifically through reduction of carbon levels in our atmosphere. We do educational events, presentations, calls to action, and we partner with other organizations in the community with things that we feel are going to help reach our goal, which is, again, to lower the carbon levels. And you can find us at 350placer.org. You can also sign up for our newsletter at 350placer.org, and we'll add you to that. So many of you know that in 2018, the IPCC and actually the US government both put out a pretty stark warning that we have 12 years to limit climate change in order to avoid catastrophe. And of course, that was 2 years ago. So the time is now. It's very urgent that we take action. But the good news is that it's not too late. So with that being said, you know, I know that there's a lot of connection between human health and our planet's health. And I realize that it's part of climate change that I'm just moderately educated about. And so I want to introduce two doctors who are experts on this and have a presentation. We're going to go ahead and have them give their presentations, and then there'll be a question and answer session. So I'd just like to really quickly tell you who they are on paper, and then they can tell you a little bit more about themselves. Christine Newsom was born and raised on the San Francisco Peninsula, attended UC Davis undergraduate and School of Medicine, and did her internal medicine residency at UCD Medical Center, Children's Hospital of San Francisco, and UCSF. She practiced general internal medicine in San Francisco and then in Grass Valley for 30 years before retiring in 2011. Dr. Newsom has been interested in the interface of social justice issues with medicine her whole career, beginning with the nuclear arms buildup in the 1980s, at which time she became an active member of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Over the last decade, her concerns have turned to the effects of climate change, and in particular, educating the public about the physical, emotional, and social effects of this crisis. And then Dr. Brad Miller is also retired, but he had a BA in history from UC Davis. He went to the UC Davis School of Medicine in 1981, and then he practiced internal medicine in Grass Valley, primary care, hospital medicine, critical care, hospice and palliative medicine. He was the medical director of Hospice at the Foothills from 1998 to 2012, and he was an attending physician at UCSF for palliative care services. So I think all that is to say is that they're both pretty qualified as medical professionals. And so with that introduction, I would like to go ahead and pass this screen and the presentation over to Brad. But one more thing is that I wanted to, everybody who's watching this as a recording, 350 Placer, we're not necessarily technically savvy, but we wanted to get this information to you. So please be patient with any Zoom maneuvering we need to do while we're playing this.
Okay, thank you. I'm really enjoying the rain these days. It just started raining here again up on Banner Mountain, and I'm just really having a good time this spring, putting in the garden and everything. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and especially thank Lizzie and Kara for organizing this and helping make this happen. We're all living in truly unprecedented times of crisis, threat, and yet opportunity. The COVID crisis has really shaken our everyday lives like nothing that I can remember. And those of us who share concern about our climate and energy future are uniquely situated, I think, to learn and communicate significant lessons from the pandemic crisis, which is taking place within the larger climate crisis. Our readiness to advocate for meaningful climate action at home and in the political sphere creates a powerful opportunity for us to understand and communicate the key teaching of this pandemic, which is that the health of our planet is totally connected to human health and well-being. And so my friend and colleague, Chris and I will try to connect the dots, and we'll all continue to learn together about this. So she just went over my CV. The other thing to add is that I've done really quite a lot of teaching in the last 20 years as well. A little more personally, I'm retired. I'm a lover of the natural world, and that's why I live where I live, and I'm sure that describes all of you as well. I'm also a patient. I have some health conditions that are, although under control, keep me in a high risk group, and not much I can do to change that. I'm a husband, father, grandfather, and so these are a number of the reasons why I am worried. Oh, also, I should mention that I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby of Nevada County, and Reed and I are colleagues in that, and that's the organization I've chosen to put my energies into. And we're really happy to be collaborating with 350 Classic. So these are my grandkids, and that's my wife there. And I wanted to mention that every time these kids get a virus, they wheeze. They have a tendency to asthma, and as we'll see, that's not good when it comes to our climate future. And I wanted to add that last fall, my good friend Bill told me we need to do everything we can to address the climate crisis. And that's what we need to tell our grandchildren going forward. So these are my objectives for my part of the talk today. We're going to share public health and medical perspectives. We're going to review the impacts of climate change on several diseases. We're going to emphasize the common values of caring and protecting, and emphasize the key point, which is that climate solutions are health solutions. We all decided that we would limit our comments about climate solutions, mainly because I think all of you are familiar with that, and we've all been working on that. We want to emphasize the health background and the connection of health solutions to climate solutions. So, basics about public health. Public health is defined in this top couple lines here, and it's what we do collectively to assure conditions to help people have a healthy and happy life. As an emergency, climate change is unique. It's unlike, a human emergency. If I have an illness and go to the ER, there's a beginning and a middle and hopefully a good end to that story. But with climate change, there's no distinct beginning, middle, or end. And so that's important, I think, to bear in mind. As Lizzie commented earlier, the fourth National Climate Assessment is this foundational document, and it's the source for really almost everything I'm going to talk about here. And it's also the kind of fundamental document that is the source for researchers today in academia and government. This is also a point at which I want to thank our public health officer here in Nevada County, Ken Cutler, who has collaborated with us for public presentations. He's a bit preoccupied now, as you can imagine. And also want to thank your public health officer, Amy Sisson. We are hoping to collaborate with her in the future for a presentation like this. Their teams are doing amazing work right now. So this is a synopsis put together by Catherine Hayhoe, one of our other great sources of information and inspiration. She is one of the authors of the fourth National Climate Assessment. And this is stuff that we all know and we are acting on, but it's worth emphasizing that we have choices and our action is very, very important and meaningful. This is kind of a synopsis of the climate science and greenhouse effect. You're all familiar with that. This is a great communication tool about global warming and the greenhouse effect, the baby in a blanket. And you can use this in talking to people about climate change. Another interesting background issue that I think is important is that of threat perception. People have a tendency naturally to ignore or discount things that seem far away in space or time. But one of the benefits of framing all this stuff in terms of health is it tends to bring it closer to home because we all have personal and family and community concerns. So for those of us who live in the foothills, the most immediate area that makes this real is wildfire. And I don't need to tell any of you about what's going on with that, except to point out that although climate change is a big factor in raising the risk, it's not the sole cause of wildfire risk. Also very important is that the threats that we're talking about interact in really complicated ways, and one thing leads to another. In the middle of this slide lists some of the other things, how disasters tend to promulgate other complications. And then public safety power shutoffs from a health perspective, that's created a lot of issues in the public health arena. This is an image of the, for me, beloved Sierra snowpack. On the right-hand side is a projection of how things may look at the end of the century if we don't do anything, and it's barren. And not only is that a threat economically and environmentally, but it brings along with it a whole lot of water and related health issues. So this is another really foundational, important public health concept, and that's the precautionary principle. And this says that if there is scientific uncertainty, we should aim to resolve it in favor of prevention and the best interests of human health. That's really in play today, in the press especially. So this and the next slide refer to, in very general terms, the way that health professionals think about solutions. This slide is all about our, let's see if I can get my pointer to work. This is all about the actions that we're all passionate about: reducing emissions, working on agriculture, food, transportation. And over here, the health co-benefits: a healthy planet, healthy people. Lastly, in general terms, values. Being a health professional is fundamentally about protecting and caring for individuals and community health. This is not unlike the values we bring to being parents, spouses, neighbors, and it's sort of a stepping stone towards how a health and caring framework can be a very strong way to communicate about climate change. So these are the illnesses that we're going to review, and it should come as no surprise that with an unhealthy earth, we have a lot of health consequences. Again, a little big picture here. None of the weather phenomena, climate phenomena, illnesses, and diseases are new. But with a changing climate, everything's going to accelerate, like on steroids, Catherine Hayhoe says. And this is where climate change becomes a threat multiplier. So who's the most vulnerable? It's elderly people, people with chronic illnesses, and then socioeconomic issues come into play really in a big way. Poor people, low income, minorities. So this is a slide I just picked up yesterday at a webinar, and this is showing urban heat islands in Richmond, Virginia. This is very newly published data. And these red zones are where the temperatures are the highest in a heat wave. Also where poor people live in Richmond, tends to be poor Black people. And this is a superimposed image of where the most frequent ambulance calls go out during the heat wave. And I think that's a very powerful image. So Nevada County, this just covers some of the environmental issues that put us at risk here. And we're talking wildfire, outdoor workers, and then a lot of increased housing insecurity for many people. So this is a structural slide that talks about how health and climate change outcomes interact with very complicated social, behavioral, environmental, and institutional contexts. And so from a health perspective, the climate drivers, all these familiar issues that we talk about, create exposure pathways, which then create changes and problems with health outcomes. So the first one we're going to emphasize is extreme heat. Heat waves create heat injuries. We're talking heat stroke and heat exhaustion, this kind of thing. Outdoor workers are extremely vulnerable to these problems. It's very localized. A heat wave in Grass Valley creating consequences for people is in the high 90s, whereas in San Francisco, we're talking in the mid 80s. So we're living through the hottest years on record in recent years. The National Climate Assessment is advising that in the climate future without action, that this may increase from baseline in the few hundreds to thousands, maybe even tens of thousands nationally. One event in Chicago in 1995 led to 700 deaths. In Europe, 70,000 deaths were attributed to heat. So outdoor air quality, air pollution issues, another very, very key area. The middle here is the exposure pathways. We're talking about ozone, particulate matter pollution. These have been documented to go up with rising global temperatures. Wildfire brings very dangerous particulate matter pollution. And then also we're dealing with pollen and longer seasons and allergy issues. These all lead to complications for risk groups. This slide talks about especially ozone and particle pollution and their impacts. Ozone tending to be associated with acute problems and particulates with both acute and chronic symptoms. And down below here, it may be a little hard to see that I'm going to not mess with my fancy stuff here. These are a number of conditions that have been clearly documented to be aggravated by air pollution. Air pollution in California has already been documented at baseline to be associated with over 20,000 deaths per year. And this is projected to go up significantly in the future. This is some very recent data from our two counties, State of the Air report from Lung Association. We both tied with F grades. It's on an A through F. And you can look at these numbers. This is ozone for our two counties. Orange is dangerous for high risk groups. Red is dangerous for everybody. Purple is off the charts. And this is for 2019, number of days in each of these zones. And they use those to calculate our global scores, which are not very good. And then this is our risk populations in Nevada and Placer counties. These are the disease risk areas across the top. And I want to try to, okay. And just take in these numbers, and we won't spend a lot of time on it, but hold these in mind when you hear about the things Chris has to say. So we're connecting air pollution and disadvantaged communities with the COVID crisis, and Chris is going to talk about that in more detail. This is your neighbors up here. This is during the campfire, and this shows the map of these really bad air regions: Grass Valley, Nevada City, purple. And you guys were pretty bad down in Placer County also there. I hope you can see my cursor in there. This is Campfire Emergency Department visits, Sacramento. This is in the days following the big fire. And then just a sidebar on medications. Many may make you more sensitive to heat. This is a list of many of the medicines that are especially vulnerable. So I'm sure with your evacuation plans, you have a go bag with meds if needed. Be ready to transport that stuff in a cooler. So turn to page. Mental health is a huge issue. I think that there's just vast amounts of spiritual and emotional distress that breaks out with the events. We're seeing this now, of course, with the COVID crisis. If people have pre-existing mental health issues, they tend to be much worsened. These are some of the terms over here that we are all experiencing: climate grief, eco-anxiety, and this is very substantial area of concern. Floods and other disasters have resulted in research which has really documented the aggravation of mental health conditions, PTSD, violence domestically, interpersonally, an increased death rate among those who have pre-existing mental health problems in heat waves. We're starting to see similar stuff with COVID as well. So resilience, we're very resilient as humans, but there's many folks who carry this on in pathologic, dysfunctional ways. These days, this slide was created before the COVID crisis, and certainly we're all thinking about first responders a lot. Now in this crisis, these folks carry huge burdens of mental health troubles, and this gives some numbers following Katrina. The good news is that effective risk communication tends to promote adaptive responses and actions. So that's why leadership is very important. Mental health professionals have researched and practiced some very valuable approaches to care, and these are sort of the areas of how they do that. Psychological first aid. It's good to know that this has been worked on. So how are you all doing with this current crisis? We all are facing another fire season. I'm going, oh no. And it was tough last year. So flooding. This is another big area, a lot of health outcome things that are pretty obvious. And this is another area that takes things to happen before, during, and after the event, the storm surge. Drought. Dust Bowl took place over a few years and was devastating to this country. Forecasts are for mega droughts of decades long in our climate future, and we're probably already in such a prolonged drought in the Southwest, including Southern California. Water issues, aquifers under threat. Imagine the health consequences of no running water: dehydration, hygiene issues, emotional distress, cost. Public safety power shutoff is an issue there too. Water quality, this is a list of some of the waterborne illnesses that tend to break out after a big flood. Extreme events obviously cause a sort of cascade of disaster in the healthcare infrastructure, supply chains. Food quality is another big area, and this is a very interesting, complex area. And let's just say that food insecurity is a baseline issue for a lot of families and groups. So this is where, you know, threat multipliers comes into play. If you're already marginal with your nutrition and our protein value in our food is reduced, that's not a good thing. So then finally are vector-borne infections. We're talking about ticks and mosquitoes. Chris is going to talk about animal sources of infection in her talk. So expanded shifting zones, prolonged season. This is the list of diseases. And northeast of US, Lyme disease has really expanded. Dr. Cutler tells me we haven't really documented this in Nevada County yet, but stay tuned. These are some other significant illnesses that could expand in the future. So this has been a quick whirlwind through all these disease states, and we've looked at how climate drivers create these exposure pathways and change and worsen outcomes in terms of risks and exposures. It's really hard to predict exactly how this whole thing's going to play out. It's so complex, but we know we have ample reason for concern already. So it's real, folks, and I don't need to tell you all that. But we have this incredible opportunity, and we can flatten the climate curve with climate solutions leading to health benefits and solutions. So this is for everyone that we do this work. So talk about this with everybody you know. Don't stop, don't give up, and thank you all for all that you're doing. That's it, and I'll pass the baton to Chris.
Well, again, I'd like to thank also Lizzie and Kara and 350 Placer for having Brad and me speak today, because we obviously feel this is a very important topic. When I retired 9 years ago and decided I wanted to work more actively on the climate crisis, I assumed I would be pivoting away from my life career in healthcare. But it wasn't long before I realized that, in fact, climate change played a huge role in many of our health challenges, as Brad has just outlined. And now, in just the last few short months, we've had a crash course in how our global response to an illness has a lot to do with how well we've been taking care of our environment. Before I start my presentation, there are several people I'd like to acknowledge. Dr. Erin Bernstein, who's the director of the Center for Climate, Health, and Global Environment, also called C-Change, at the Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who's the director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University. And Professor Thomas Sukanik, who's a marine ecologist and researcher at UC Davis. These three individuals have provided recent webinars, which are just rich in background material that I have freely borrowed from, and I gratefully acknowledge their contributions. So let's look into how the climate crisis and the COVID crisis are similar and what they have to do with each other. First of all, as Brad touched on, we're dealing with a crisis within a crisis. The attention of the whole world and our country is pretty much focused on the pandemic. But we have to remember that as we're dealing with the pandemic every day, all of the factors leading to the climate crisis are marching on, with the possible exception of the rate of fossil fuel production. We've seen some beautiful blue skies over formerly foggy cities like New Delhi and Beijing, and that's been pretty heartening. But by and large, the factors leading to climate change have not reduced. We have to remember that climate change is a threat multiplier, as Brad touched on. What does that exactly mean? Well, it means that it takes something that is an already existing situation and makes it much worse. For example, if someone gets COVID-19 in an area that is polluted and has an underlying lung condition, that the COVID infection will produce much worse wheezing or pulmonary complications. What about an actual causative relationship? Has climate change caused the coronavirus pandemic? We can't say that it has. It's much too early for us to say that definitively. A lot of research is being intensely done to try to answer that question. What we do know from a lot of research that has been done in the past is that we do know the origins of similar viral zoonoses, which is the word we use for a disease that has originated in the animal world and has been transmitted from animals to humans. The next slide comes from recent research that has been released from the World Wildlife Federation. Down at the bottom under number 1, you see a drawing of some deforestation that is being done, which reduces the habitat for animals, of course, causing them to have to infringe on human population areas. Other activities such as species collecting and trafficking in wild animals also increases the human to animal interface. When animals are brought to market, there's crowding and closeness between the species. And if the animals are actually slaughtered there in the market, that's referred to as a wet market. So there's more wet markets. And then you see up at the top, there's examples of animals being exposed to other animals that they don't normally come in contact with. And then animals coming in contact with humans that they don't normally share an interface with. And so that results in transmission from animals to other animals and animals to humans, and eventually humans to humans. So these are the pathways to epidemics that we have not seen occur prior to the last few decades, when there have been increasing intrusion of one form or another of humans into animal habitats. Well, what are some parallels between what you might think of as the two pathologic agents causing the two crises we're talking about? Let's look at this chart here, or these two columns. Causing the COVID-19 pandemic is a biologic agent. Its official name is SARS-CoV-2. That's the name of the virus. Causing climate change is primarily carbon dioxide. It's actually a collection of chemical agents that we refer to as greenhouse gases. They include, besides carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and some others. But we'll just use carbon dioxide as the prototype. The virus, of course, is very contagious. Carbon dioxide is a very powerful heat-trapping gas. The virus is spread by humans. Climate change is, carbon dioxide is generated by humans. And the factors controlling climate change are, of course, largely controlled by humans. What they have in common is that they disproportionately affect the poor, the chronically ill, and populations of color. The time frame is different. The COVID pandemic has been occurring and changing over days to weeks. We're getting up every day and learning something new on our radio or TV. As soon as we turn on any medium, we find out something has changed with the pandemic. With climate change, changes are occurring over more like months to years, which means that it takes longer to grab our attention, unless there's an acute weather event that has happened, like our wildfires. The next line here is very important. Both of these crises transcend national borders. And that means we are fooling ourselves if we think that we can solve these problems without consultation and cooperation with our global partners. Now, one thing I didn't write here on this chart, but both of these situations require expert guidance. These are highly technical situations that do require experts in these fields. And unfortunately, expert guidance has often been ignored. And we are reaping the benefits in both cases of having that expert guidance not heeded. And as we've heard from Brad, the effects of both situations are being felt right now. What else are we seeing between the two? Well, both conditions represent a human physical and psychological issue. The physical, again, obvious. People are suffering mightily, both morbidity and mortality. Psychologically, we heard about the different emotional and mental health challenges facing us from climate change. And how about from the pandemic? I would imagine well, I won't imagine, but I'll ask you, have any of you been feeling a certain amount of anxiety from the last couple of months? I'll share with you what I went through when I went into our local grocery store about 6 weeks ago and saw a shelf that looked like that there. This isn't my store, but it looked sort of like that. It's the first time I've ever seen a shelf look that empty anywhere in our county. And I had a little wave of panic go through me. It really hit me for the first time ever, what we're going through. And I don't panic that easily, but it made me realize I was living in an event that I had never lived through in my life. So I think we're all prone to this. Both these conditions represent economic security issues. We all know people, I would venture to guess, who have become unemployed the last few months, who are economically insecure. And this is exactly what we're facing with climate change. How about a national security issue? I'm going to read you a couple of examples. There was a Pentagon report submitted to Congress in January 2019 assessing 79 operationally critical military installations in the United States. Over 2/3 of these were threatened by climate change: flood, drought, wildfires, or a combination of them. And this didn't even address military installations overseas. This was a Pentagon report. The Department of Defense is also very concerned about the fossil fuel needs of our military forces overseas, and they are very much interested in finding alternatives to fossil fuels. Similarly, with regard to the virus, you all recall the epidemic aboard the aircraft carrier that struck over a month ago, that took this massive weapon system out of play till today. I heard this morning on the news that the aircraft carrier was released for duty. Now, can you imagine the cost that involved, not to mention the national security risk to have the carrier out of duty for that long? So, national security issues. How about societal instability issues? Well, when you have the potential for widespread unemployment, homelessness, and instability, especially among disadvantaged populations, societal issues may become the paramount crises that we face as soon as quarantines are lifted. And finally, political issues. I don't need to elaborate, I think, how much both climate change and the pandemic have become political. Well, what about solutions to how we're going to get through this pandemic, how we're going to avoid future pandemics, and what in the world we're going to do about climate change? As Brad mentioned, this presentation today, we are not going to delve deeply into solutions, but I am going to just bring up solutions to put them into context of what we are talking today. We're decades past the point where personal actions alone are enough to solve the underlying factors causing climate change, just as it would be irrational to think that our individual actions alone could halt the COVID pandemic. The solutions must be systemic, as bipartisan or non-political as possible, and based on expert scientific data. We have some precedents. I'm going to show you some photos that I took several years ago when my husband and I visited the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C. It was a beautiful memorial, and the statues were something really, the sculptures were beautiful. Here are people in breadlines. We may be seeing a lot of this over the next year. Signs of unemployment and hunger. Here we see one of FDR's quotes: "No country, however rich, can afford the waste of its human resources. Demoralization caused by vast unemployment is our greatest extravagance. Morally, the greatest menace to our morally, it is the greatest menace to our social order." Some of this is missing over on the upper right-hand side, but that's where he pledges a new deal. The New Deal. I pledge you, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. I propose to create a civilian conservation corps to be used in simple work. More important, however, than the material gains will be the moral and spiritual value of such work. And finally, he had an interesting insight. Men and nature must work hand in hand. The throwing out of balance of the resources of nature throws out of balance also the lives of men. So that was the precedent of the previously greatest threat to our society, social threat, not counting our wars, but that was the Great Depression. There was another example. That was the effort to get to the moonshot. And here's a quote from John Kennedy. Now, part of this is obscured by the gallery shots. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to read the whole thing, but I'll try. We choose these goals not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. Okay, that's not to say everybody was on the same page about everything in the 1960s, but nevertheless, that was one project that took an enormous amount of unification, and we pulled it off. So what needs to happen now? Well, as you all know, the solutions to the climate crisis generally fall into two large categories. We either produce less carbon dioxide or we remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Let's look at the pie chart of which sectors of the economy are responsible for generating what fractions of greenhouse gases. And then we get a sense of where we need to apply our efforts. We can see that transportation, electricity generation, and industry are each responsible for roughly a quarter of greenhouse gas release. So this is where we would apply answers like reforming transport, cleaning up electricity with renewables, and making buildings and manufacturing as efficient as possible. Most importantly, and this cannot be stressed enough, the most important path to producing less carbon dioxide is by consuming less and wasting less. Our hyper-consuming society needs to learn another path. Westerners consume 5.5 Earths worth of goods every year, and that simply is not sustainable. So that's producing less carbon dioxide. How about removing more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Well, there is such a technique as removing carbon dioxide. It's called direct air capture. There are some companies that are doing this, but it's a new technology, and that's not likely to be the real answer, the main answer. The major activities capable of removing carbon dioxide are nature's own methods, which are reforestation and sustainable agriculture. And these are by far worthy of our greatest efforts in removing carbon dioxide. Can we afford to do this? Well, I think the more important question that we have learned in the last 2 months is, can we afford not to? We did not hesitate to answer that question affirmatively when it came to the COVID pandemic, because we were able to imagine the alternative to not helping our fellow citizens. Trillions of dollars of relief aid has been passed by Congress. Pandemic preparation is being made, and pandemic preparation reform is being made, and community mobilization is being established like never before. We need to have the courage to face climate reality, talk about the climate crisis with our family and friends, and make it clear what happens if we do not commit ourselves with the same courage and dedication to saving the lives and future of the planet. I'm going to close with a video clip of Dr. Bernstein from Harvard School of Public Health. He summarized the interplay among humans, pandemic disease, and the climate more succinctly and eloquently than I think I ever could. So give me a moment to cue this up.
I think in addition to what Professor Hayhoe said, which I agree with entirely, is, we don't know much about the life forms we share the planet with. We have exquisite details about the atmospheric chemistry of the Earth, down to many orders of magnitude below zero. We have measured the distance from Earth to other planets to excruciating detail. And we don't know how many life forms we share the Earth with by an order of magnitude. And yet we see already that these diseases that are coming into us are overwhelmingly coming from these other life forms. And it is high time, my friends, to figure out exactly what we share this planet with and what they do for a living. Before these shots from over our bow from nature, we've had COVID, SARS, HIV, MERS, influenza, also a zoonotic disease. Before we're too late, nature is trying to tell us something. And so climate change fundamentally changes the rules for the game of life, right? So everything on this planet depends on a temperature, a precipitation regime, which way the wind is blowing. And by changing these foundations of life on Earth, we should absolutely expect nature to behave differently. Now, the problem is we know so little about nature, it's very hard to understand in great certainty what that means. But it is already clear, as Professor Hayhoe showed, climate change is changing where we see diseases. And you don't need a COVID to make the world have major problems from diseases, even small outbreaks by comparison. Think about Ebola. So the big, most recent Ebola outbreak in West Africa, which had a very high mortality rate, caused concern around the world, affected the global economy. It is likely that that disease moved to a new part of Africa because of deforestation, that the bats lost their habitat. A disease called Nipah virus that emerged in Malaysia, first in the late 90s. The bats that transmitted that to pigs and people probably were forced to feed on mango trees near farms because of an unprecedented drought that killed off their food supplies. And so, we're looking at the tapestry of life through a telescope, and we see a little part of it, and every time we look around, we see something pop out into us. And we still don't have a good enough picture to see broadly, but the evidence as we see it now makes it abundantly clear that if you want to prevent disease emergence like COVID, we would not be doing what we're doing to the climate. And it would be enough reason for all the other things we've talked about with climate and health to deal with climate change, but obviously infections is another reason as well.
To Lizzie.
Yes.
For question.
So first of all, I wanted to say thank you so much to both Brad and Chris for taking the time and to create the presentations and share your wisdom. I really, really appreciate you being here. And let's open it up. You can all unmute yourself now if you'd like to, and see if anybody has any questions. Okay. So are there any questions for Brad or Chris?
I just like to say it was a very, very good presentation. I really appreciate the effort that went into it. It's very complete and it should be shown to a lot more people.
I agree.
Kara, did you have a question?
I have a question on I think that, COVID has given people just a taste of what change in their life feels like, and how can we better use that feeling, because I think that's what's held people back, is like they haven't experienced it. Did seem out in the future, but how can we relate that feeling of disruption to moving people forward on climate change?
it's walking a fine line, because what you don't want to do is paralyze people and have them react by saying, I've hit the wall. I had just about as much bad news as I can take. Stop. Can't take anymore. I think if you follow it up by saying, the good news is we have more time with climate change. You know, with this virus, we, as I showed in that chart, we have days to weeks to move. If we don't do such and such, then a lot of people are going to get sick within days. You know, with climate change, we do need action right away, but we do have a bit longer. That's of some reassurance, I think. If people have children, that's a big motivator. As Brad said, that's why the two of us are active, grandkids, you know. Those are just two suggestions.
Yeah, so, I think that's kind of the $64,000 question, is how to take the learning that we're hoping we're gaining, this experience of things being completely disrupted by these natural phenomena, and help people understand how these are potentially connected. And I'm still working on how to articulate that. I heard a speaker asked a similar question a couple weeks ago, and part of the question was also alluding to the fact that, you know, if we start, you know, preaching about how, you know, the sky is falling with COVID and all that, and that's what's going to happen with climate change, there's a risk of being perceived with that type of rhetoric as somehow exploiting this crisis in a somehow negative way. And the speaker responded by saying, you know, really, this guy's name was Dr. Maybach. And he was saying, really, you know, there's no better time for us to talk about this than now, because people's eyes are wide open to the fact that the natural world is having this huge impact. We're all connected. The supply chains, yeah, there's problems there. We need to work on our resilience, but we need to use this type of activity and awareness to prepare for these other things that are coming down the track. And so you know, the opportunity to try to speak about this is very valuable. I want to thank you guys again, because I'm still looking for the language for how to say that, and say we need to really knuckle down and keep this spirit of connectedness in these times moving forward for action. I think Chris also began to speak about how it is really possible to mobilize our government and our society in a common effort to take on a huge challenge and succeed. And we do have the resources to do that. Sure, we're spending a ton of money, but there's also this question of the cost of not acting. And we're seeing how that's come down, because we could have taken more wise action, more clever action weeks, months ago. And, you know, the failure to work with the experts in an optimum way is costing us a lot. And so that's another, I think, rhetorical and fact evidence-based argument to make, to say there's a huge cost of not acting. And I think that we're going to find that there's a return on investment for supporting people who are out of work, because the cost of not doing that is too staggering to contemplate. So,
I have a question. Given that we've already seen that, for example, California is cutting back on huge amounts of its budget that was going toward environmental issues, as well as the national government doing the same thing. And
yeah.
But they're already cutting back on a lot of regulations, deals to the fossil fuel industries, etc.
Yeah, it's really going to take a lot to keep our eye on the ball. And you're right, Don, that there's a lot of unfounded moves taking place now. I mean, in a way, I think the Trump administration is taking advantage of this situation to, try to finish their destruction of the regulatory world and the environment. It's really a shame.
Brad or Chris, do you have any feeling that the polling that's showing kind of a mood swing about government intervention and things, or government support for things that's been caused by the pandemic, will be persuasive at all in talking about how health and climate are connected and we can do things about it?
I have a hopeful feeling. It's sort of I get that connection you're making, and I'm hoping that there'll be sort of this aha moment for people like, wow, the government can do things that are beneficial to the common good, and that the common good is something worth putting all this energy and money into. Obviously, that is already under attack by the very people who a couple of weeks ago were sounding like they were waking up. So it's going to be a tough thing. And of course, we're in an election year, which, one of the other areas of solutions that you're all aware of is we have to vote, get out the vote, and try to put in leaders who are going to hold everybody's feet to the fire.
I'm afraid that there may be an increasing number of people who are connecting the dots between that we were just talking about in our presentations, but that there's so much fear about where's our next meal going to come from, where's our next pay, how are we going to pay the bills at the end of the month? In other words, short-term concerns, which is totally understandable. So much concern there that it's going to be hard for a huge fraction of the populace to share the long-term view. I just don't know how many are going to be able to have that 10-year scope of vision that is required, let alone 50 years.
So I want to wrap it up. I want to be respectful of the time of this and everything. But I was wondering, Betty, did you have a question? You seemed like you maybe wanted to ask something, or?
Yes. Am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
What I think I need to do, and I ask everyone else to do, is to develop an elevator speech, which is 2 to 3 minutes, about the connection between COVID-19 and climate change. Us speaking it in a clear and concise way is a start. And then the next step, Ken Moore, would be to find a movie about it.
The other thing that I wanted to say is that I have a local TV show on just Auburn Community Television, and it's all about climate change. And I was recently able to interview the chief economic advisor to the governor and ask him some questions about climate change. And one thing that he really focused on is our ability to innovate. And, when I think about the problems that are at hand, both socially, economically, I mean, just all of the layers, when you think about the moonshot, or you think about things that you never knew were possible, and yet we made them possible. So it's sort of like, how do you transcend that? Like, we're not going to cut directly through. It's not going to be linear. If it was linear, we wouldn't get there in time. But one of the ways that I'm inspired is that we are capable of innovation. And I was really appreciative of his answer to that question that I asked him, because I think of innovation as just economic, and the good news is that it can be. And so the question of people's, where is my next meal going to come from? What if people's next meal can come from working on the solution? And I don't know how we get there, but that's something that I've been really holding close to my heart since I had that interview, because it makes me hopeful, and it makes me believe that it's possible. So that's all. That's all I have to say. So, oh, go ahead, Betty.
Also, I actually kind of talked with Jennifer Wood, who's the leader of Citizens Climate Lobby in this region. Is that about accurate, Ken Moore? Is that about an accurate way to say it? Yeah, I talked to her about how the carbon tax that she described was muddy. It was unclear. And so what she and I did on line with each other was to practice an elevator speech about what the carbon tax is. And it really cleared up a lot. So I suggest that if people start to develop their own elevator speech about the connection between the virus and climate, they practice with a friend and time it. And if the friend can say, I didn't get that, or that didn't make sense to me, rewind, and then really get good at it. You know, like be a little mini Toastmasters with a friend.
So guess what, Betty? You and I, in the next couple weeks, we'll do another Zoom meeting, and you can practice your elevator speech, and then we'll publish it, and we can direct people to an example of an elevator speech, both for the carbon tax as well as whatever other elevator speeches you have.
I really appreciate that, Betty, because what we've given you today is like the epic poem, the Virgil of climate change and COVID and yada, yada. And it's really true. We need to bring it to a haiku version here.
Okay, everybody, I'm going to close this for the evening to be respectful of everyone's time. But Brad and Chris, thank you so much again for your time and your expertise and your presentation. We so appreciate it. And we'll send you the link when we have it up on YouTube.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you both, and thank you, Lizzie.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Oh,
Thank you.
absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I so appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Right.